Okay, so it's 2 minutes past, and I think we should start. People are still arriving, but we'll have a little introduction. So welcome everybody to the State of the Art talk for February. This is the ESI, Environment and Sustainability Institute, has a monthly event where we feature one of our academics, and we're really pleased that Stuart Townley's agreed to do our talk this month. It's also a chance for us to celebrate their work more generally, and you'll have seen if you follow our social media platforms that Amrita's been putting out a steady stream of posts all about the diverse work that Stuart does. So it's a great chance for us to celebrate Stuart now, but also across the month. And as it happens, I've been reading a really great book, which I just finished at the weekend. It's called Range. I don't know if you can see that on my screen. How Generalists Triumph in a Specialised World. It's by David Epstein. It was a Sunday Times top 10 best-selling book. And it's all about the virtue of being a broad thinker and having intellectual curiosity. So you take an idea from one field and you apply it to another, or you have a problem that you need to address from lots of different perspectives. And that, of course, is exactly what the ESI is set up to do, to foster interdisciplinary thinking and scholarship and intellectual curiosity around questions of the environment and sustainability. And Stuart is probably our best champion of exactly this. He is the most intellectually curious person you can imagine, because he applies maths and mathematical thinking to pretty much, I would reckon, any topic you want to put in front of him. So I just had a look at his website before. In 2020, he published papers on artificial intelligence in healthcare, renewable energy, and COVID-19 modelling using data from Pakistan. And in 2019, he published a paper on fisheries and climate change in seabirds, and another one identifying the patients that are prone to acute kidney injury when they arrive at hospital. There cannot be many academics with a publishing profile as diverse and far-ranging as that. It's absolutely remarkable, and it's absolutely what this guy says we need in this present world, where we're more and more specialised. And to succeed, you have to have more and more detailed knowledge. It often provides a blinker for thinking about the wicked problems in our world that require much more creative thought across a whole gamut of areas, and we need the language and the means to do that. So Stuart is a great champion for intellectual curiosity and interdisciplinary working. He came to the University of Exeter in 1990, so he's one of our longest serving academics, I would say, getting on for, well, 20 years celebration this year. 30. He came to us via Bath, and before that was at Warwick, where he did his undergraduate and PhD. He's also one of the longest standing members of the ESI, so it's great to have Stuart with us today to do this talk. He's going to speak for about, well, maximum 40 minutes, hopefully, and then there'll be time for questions, discussion, anything you want for the final 20 minutes, or in fact 15. Now I've talked for 5 minutes, for which apologies. So over to Stuart.
Okay, thanks for those kind words, Jane. I hope my talk isn't going to disappoint after such a grand introduction. So why did I choose this title? So the title of my talk is Mathematics, the Language of Collaboration. So often when we have these ESI away days, well, we used to have them in the past, and we'd write down these collabograms about, who's collaborating with who, and it was always Marcus Muller and myself, that always came out with the most number of collaborators within the ESI. And so I thought, well, maybe I can put together a talk around that topic. So that's where we are. And before setting off, I'd just like to thank 4 people that helped me put this talk together. So that's Ali, Sarah Alacy, Tassos Argyropoulos, Gwangli, and Mehmet Yavas, and their contributions will hopefully come evident as I get through my talk. So just as a help myself as much as anything, as a bit of a structure. So the talk is sort of in 2 parts. Firstly, it's a bit of historical journey, talking about my collaboration, and along 2 axes, one axis an international axis and another axis across disciplines. I then come around to what I think is the sort of central reason why mathematics collaborates with so many disciplines and in so many languages or with so many nationalities, and that's the role of formulas in mathematics. And then I'm going to spend the last bit of the talk on talking about two collaborations in detail. One that actually drew me into interdisciplinarity in the first place, and then what I would call my most extreme collaboration to date. So when I set off on this task of writing this talk, I sort of was a bit surprised myself. So I start with this mathematics, a language for all nations, right? And so I just looked back at my publication record and then just totted up the number of nationalities as co-authors from 1990 to today. And I got this graph. I start with a graph. So you can see that in the early days, it was stuck at about 3, which was basically my supervisor, PhD supervisor, and some of his friends. But then it's gradually grown over time and reaching now 24 countries. So I have over 80 co-authors from my publications from 24 countries and 6 continents. So far, I don't have a collaborator on the Antarctic. And obviously, most of my collaborators are from the UK, are UK-based, but I do have collaborators from America, several from Germany, most of them from, in the early days, were from Germany because of a particular focus of the work we were doing. Saudi Arabia is coming fourth at the moment. That's because I'm at that moment co-supervisor or second supervisor for 7 Saudi PhD students, right? So they're sort of quite high on the list at the moment. And so the bar chart of flags is obviously, I went down to the one that I have 2 national people from, and I didn't bother with the bar chart for the other 10, but I have some singletons. So in particular, I have a collaborator, a PhD student from Botswana a long time ago, and currently a PhD student from New Zealand, and so forth. So, I mean, I don't know how that fares up to most other people's spread of nationalities as their co-authors, but it seems quite a lot for me. So anyway, I wanted to sort of get across this idea that in order to do mathematics, one doesn't need to speak the language of the collaborator. And so I was grateful to be visited by Mehmet Yavuz of the last year. Unfortunately, the visit was rather disrupted by the COVID pandemic. But anyway, he was working on some SIR modeling, and we ended up writing this paper with some co-authors, and so the flags of the co-authors are in the bottom right-hand corner. So this is a collaboration between Pakistan, India, China, Turkey, and the UK. And my sort of thesis here is that you don't need to read the Turkish to understand what this is about. So in this bottom left-hand box is your classical SIR model, which anybody that works in epidemiology will recognize as an SIR model. And in this model, we've introduced a control term, which is the treatment of that disease. And then for people working in optimal control, they would recognize this as a performance index to be minimized by choosing the control term U, and to minimize the impact of the disease through the number of infecteds, right? So the argument is that I don't need to read Turkish to be able to work with my Turkish colleague, although he was very able to speak English with me, right? So that's a SIR model. And if anybody's interested, this is the paper that I'm referring to here that we published at the beginning of this year, I think. This next example is some work that Marcus and myself and 2 of our Saudi PhD students are looking at, right? So again, the flags in the bottom right-hand corner are the international collaborations going on here. And in this problem, the central focus of the problem is a very simple predator-prey equation. So anybody working in population ecology would recognize this as a predator-prey interaction. And to this predator-prey interaction, we've introduced an additional term, a forcing term, due to the destructive influence of plastics on that predator-prey interaction. and we're exploring the dynamics of that predator-prey system under the influence of plastic. And just out of curiosity, you might say, we said, well, let's suppose that the plastic was this, whoops, gone ahead, I didn't mean to go there, was oscillating. So you could imagine that there's some, if you're talking about some predator-prey interaction going on in the oceans, and you might have some ocean cycling of plastic, so the density of plastics in any one region could be fluctuating in time, so simply here assumed to be sort of sinusoidal. And then as we wind up this parameter epsilon, you can see that the plastic disrupts this population cycle. So at the top we have a fairly classical looking predator-prey cycle between the prey and the predator. As you wind up the plastic density, so that predator-prey gets disrupted and then almost is chaotic or is gone really wild. So we're trying to understand anyway how plastic might disrupt population interactions. We started with the simplest one, the predator-prey cycle. Okay. Oh, there's a clock up there. That's good. My third example is a collaboration between China, Israel, Germany, and the UK. And it's actually where I met Marcus, right? So Marcus and I have been working together now for well over 10 years. But this is the first problem that we looked at together. So in this problem, so it's first captured by this picture. So we've got a point wave energy converter sitting in the sea. The floating part of the wave energy converter floats up and down on the sea surface and then drives a piston. And so it's modeled by this equation in red. And it's a bit complicated because the concept of mass is a bit awkward for objects sitting in the sea because of buoyancy and so forth. And so this is the motion of this point mass wave energy converter. And then this part E is a power takeoff, which basically draws on the velocity of the floating part, and then some power takeoff term, some current, control of current in the power takeoff system. And then this bit is an interesting bit of Chinese there, but basically this says that we can predict, we use some predictive technology to predict the incoming waves, which was then useful for this optimization problem. So knowing the wave a few seconds ahead was very useful in order to optimize the power takeoff for this system. So again, we can talk about this just from the point of view of the equations, and we don't need to read the Chinese. If anybody's interested, this is the paper. It was Wave Energy Converter Control by Wave Prediction and Dynamic Programming by these 5 persons. And sort of what another way of thinking about this is you could think of mathematics as the collaborators Esperanto. If anybody's old enough to remember what Esperanto is, this was this attempt, a sort of failed attempt in the 70s to combine many of the languages of Europe into a single language so that we might all speak with each other. And so I'm sort of proposing that mathematics is the collaborators Esperanto. And this is again a little bit of history. So again, I look back through my publication record and ticked off then what I considered to be the disciplines involved in those publications. And at the beginning, so for the first 10, 15 years of my academic life, I was basically working with other mathematicians. So my first degree was actually in pure mathematics. My PhD was effectively in pure mathematics. It was the applications of operator theory to a problem arising in control engineering. And then for a decade or more, I was only collaborating with other mathematicians. And then I popped in that in 2003, I actually had an art exhibition at the university, but that wasn't really a collaboration apart from with myself. But then the sort of changing moment happened in about 2004. So somebody that probably many in the university know, Professor Dave Hodgson, and currently, I guess, the director of the Centre for Ecology and Conservation. Back then, Dave was quite a lot younger than he is today, and he was seeking out some mathematical expertise because he wanted to put in some grant application, and it explicitly required the interaction between ecology and mathematics. And so we got chatting, and it turned out that the problems that the population ecologists were interested in looked to be very much like the sort of problems that we'd looked at in the past. And so we got talking, right? And so that was the sort of quite a moment. Anyway, since then, so since 2004, then I've developed, our collaborations in animal ecology, industry, plant ecology, engineering proper rather than control engineering, evolution, human health, and then most recently with history. So mathematics is all about equations, right? And it's using these equations that allow people to collaborate easily. So, you could have two people from very different nationalities that don't share a language. Maybe they neither speak English, which would be the alternative to mathematics as the language of collaboration. But if they wrote up their favorite equation on their whiteboard, they would both instantly know what each other was talking about. And so mathematics is a discipline that is sort of overwhelmed almost with equations, and there are many famous equations in mathematics, right? And so I just off the top of my head wrote them down. Oh no, I've not got that. I might skip that slide because it's ruining the train of my thought. So I just wrote down the equations that come to mind, and so there are many of them on this green board. So there's the Navier-Stokes equation, Schrödinger's equation, a Lyapunov equation, the famous Einstein equation, E equals mc squared, Pythagoras' theorem, prime number theorem, Fermat's last theorem in the margin. That's a joke. If anybody understands that joke, that's good. Bayes' theorem, the Fourier transform, the Cauchy-Riemann equations of complex analysis. So for the last sort of 15 minutes, if the clock that's up on there is correct, just to talk about two collaborations in a little bit more detail. So if you go back to this timeline for my collaborations and how I've expanded into different disciplines, I guess the sort of turning point was in about 2004 when I did suddenly start to think about collaborating outside of the narrow world of mathematics. And it was through this chance meeting with Dave Hodgson when he was exploring possible collaborators on a grant application. And from then onwards, Dave and I have written many papers together, had many joint PhD students, numerous grants, and we've even, co-written some R code for what's called Pop Demo in R. And the reason we actually ended up collaborating so strongly together was because the people that were working in population ecology and borrowing some mathematical tools, if they'd have borrowed the thing that I brought to the table, then we wouldn't have collaborated properly, and then that would have never happened, right? So it was their oversight. So what was it all about? So we were looking at modeling populations and trying to understand how the sort of life histories of those populations might change their fate in time. So for those that are not familiar with this world, so probably even at kindergarten or high school or primary school, you look at life cycle graphs of, say, frogs, tadpole, frog spawn, tadpoles, frogs. Everybody can imagine that. So you have 3 life stages of the frog, and then there's transition rates between those 3 stages, and then the population of frogs either grows or declines. And so you can model populations using age as the descriptor. So this in the middle here would be an age structured population projection model of a thing living in 3 over the lifespan of 3 years, right? So I end up with a 3x3 matrix, 3 stages, 3 age stages, describing this life cycle graph. And then if it was increasing as a population, then I would get graphs like the ones on the right. So the age densities would grow, at least asymptotically, in time. Or you might have a stage structured population of animal. So these aren't, the stages aren't ages. You've lumped together ages into bundles. So like prepubescent teenagers, and then reproduce enough adults, and then maybe non-reproducing very old adults, right? And that gives me in this case, a 3-stage structured model. And this time I said it's decreasing. So it decreases in time. And then finally, you might have a plant population. So they're now just coming up in the garden. So your bulb plants, your daffodils and your crocuses. So they come, again, they're in stages, but they have this feature that you can also progress. You don't have to, you can progress back to different stages. So you don't just make babies. As a plant, you can regress back to a bulb, or you can make seeds as a plant, as a flowering plant. So you have more complex transitions for plants than you do for animals, which don't tend to regress backwards, in stage. And then again, this is just a picture for an increasing plant population. So that's the sort of background that Dave and I were looking at. And then using these population projection matrices, you can then analyze what the fate of the population. So typically it would be here, I've got a 3-stage model with a 3x3 matrix. And here, because I've not specified the structure, I've got no zeros in my matrix. This could be age structured, stage structured for a plant or an animal, doesn't matter. For me, they're just matrix models where the key thing is this n by n matrix A that sits in this model. And then in simple terms, the growth or decline of this module is determined by the largest eigenvalue of that matrix. And then the population grows if that largest eigenvalue is bigger than 1, and it decreases if it's less than 1. And then also coming from this matrix A, we can use some other properties of the matrix A, they're called eigenvectors. Then the population asymptotes, so it's growing with a geometric rate lambda. So a year on year asymptotically it multiplies by lambda. So if it's growing, it grows if lambda is bigger than 1, inclines if lambda is less than 1. But then the structure itself of the population asymptotes to this so-called stable state structure, and this is the right eigenvector of the matrix A for the eigenvalue lambda. And then there's this thing called the asymptotic reproductive value of the population, which basically is saying asymptotically the contribution of a stage to the population as the population grows year on year through this so-called reproductive value. But for me, they're just two vectors, W and V. And so the sort of crux of the collaboration with Dave, this is the critical point, right, was in the literature that Dave was looking at the time, they were using this so-called sensitivity analysis. So you're interested in how does the growth rate, lambda, change if the entries of that matrix, if these transition rates for the species change. And then what they would use is this sensitivity analysis, which says that the rate of change of lambda with respect to one of those entries is determined by this nice simple formula. You take the reproductive rate vector and the stable stage structure vector, and then take the corresponding entries from those two vectors, the ith one for V and the jth one for W, multiply them together, and then divide by V transpose W. Then you get the rate of change of lambda with respect to the transition rate. And this gives you a way of estimating the change on lambda caused by a change on that transition rate. But it is an approximation, it's a sensitivity analysis, it's an infinitesimal calculation. And I was wondering, why are they doing that, right? You know, that's so old-fashioned. And so we looked at this sort of alternative, which was coming from control theory, which basically says if you change the growth rate of the matrix from lambda to lambda plus delta lambda, and I call lambda plus delta lambda mu so that the formula looks a bit tidier, then the required change to the entry is just got by computing this algebraic expression here involving a and mu. And so this is a formula for the required change to an entry to make the required change to an eigenvalue. And we called it the transfer function analysis of a population projection matrix. That's the title of the paper. And within the paper, we applied that. So this is a paper from 2004 with Dave. And so we applied that to a matrix of a desert tortoise, which was a declining population. So it had a matrix which was 8 by 8. So I quite liked it because it wasn't 2 by 2. It had a few entries in there. And it was declining. I think the lambda was about 0.98, so a little bit less than 1. And then the obvious question is, so how much do I need to do to improve an entry, one of the entries in the matrix, in order to make it grow? That means to put lambda equals 1. And then you can do the calculations either with this sensitivity analysis, so the old-fashioned way, or with this transfer function analysis, and then compare and contrast. So on the left side of the table, looking at entry A22, A32, 33, 43, 77, 87, just as examples, because there's many entries in the matrix, about 20 that we looked at. Then you can use the sensitivity analysis to estimate what do you need to change an entry by. So take this entry here, A32, yeah, which was standing at 0.149, in order to make a growing population that, as predicted by sensitivity analysis, this should be pushed up to 0.3 by adding on about 0.15. But this was the estimate from the sensitivity analysis. Actually, if you plug this into our formula, you actually need to increase it more. So the sensitivity calculation is an underestimate of what's actually needed. And so you then get the actual formula. And then also sensitivity analysis, because the change needed as predicted by sensitivity analysis is too great. Yeah, it would tell us we need to make a number that should be less than 1, bigger than 1, because a stasis is a number that should be less than 1. It's a survival probability. So the sensitivity analysis is saying, no, you can't do that, right? Because the slope was too great, it was saying, right? But the actual calculation says, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so basically the argument in the paper that we made in the paper was that this sensitivity analysis, not only is it sort of inaccurate, yeah, it actually makes blatantly wrong recommendations, because it's saying don't bother targeting some transition rate, yeah, because it can't achieve the growth you want, yeah, when in fact it could. So anyway, that paper was our first paper, and then we went on to write, you know, between us 20 odd plus papers with many PhD students and all sorts of collaborators, and it created a wave, a sort of bit of an industry for a while of papers being produced, probably about 100, not all just by us. And that wouldn't have happened if these people that were using the sensitivity analysis had actually done the correct thing in the first place, which wasn't really rocket science in any sense, right? Gosh, okay, time is of the essence. So anyway, so following the collaboration with Dave, as I said, I then went on to develop all sorts of collaborations in all sorts of areas, never really turning any collaboration down. And then my most recent collaboration is with history. And so you think, how on earth does that come about? Well, it's actually quite easy. We did have a combined honours program within the flexible combined honours program with history. So you could do flexible combined honours, history and maths, or maths and history. And then students in flexible combined honours can choose to do a 30 credit final year dissertation. And we, when I say we, that's Kris Allerfeldt in history and myself, were really lucky to work with a student, Alice Parfett, who was just a brilliant student, right? And so she did her dissertation with us, and her dissertation had 3 chapters, and we turned one of the chapters, yeah, into a paper, which was, I would say quite a remarkable achievement, because not only was it sort of incredible that those two disciplines could be collaborating in the first place, but then that you could turn your crazy thoughts actually into a publishable piece of work is quite an achievement, I think, for Alice. So this is the last bit of the talk then, and it's sort of quite lucky in the last couple of weeks that there's been a bit of press that gives a bit of context to what I'm going to talk about. So we learned in the last week or so that the government have been using this algorithm called Q-COVID, and they were using that to come up with this vaccination strategy that we've been going through and which has been, incredibly successful. And this algorithm was taking into account age, ethnicity, body mass, other health conditions, postcode, and then apply some algorithm, probably some clustering algorithm, to determine, who gets the jab first and then second and third and so on. And then it turned out that they had to revisit this because this sort of original clustering that they were doing had missed out some key vulnerable groups. And working with Alice, we all got a bit passionate, so we turned clustering into segregation, because that sounds worse than clustering. So clustering sounds okay, but actually segregating things sounds bad, right? So we explored this sort of algorithm determined segregation in our paper with this rather passionate title. So it's called AI-based healthcare, a new dawn or apartheid revisited. And so this is the work primarily of Alice Parfett, the student, and then myself and Kris Allerfeldt chipping in. But it isn't a collaboration between history and mathematics, right? And so what's the setup of this rather weird, crazy paper? So ideally, we'd have some massive population, the sort of populations that Google would work with, right? But we had a population of 25. It was actually Alice's close family tree, because we knew the data for that and nobody would be that offended if we used the numbers. And then these 25 individuals were linked together in a complex social network, right? Well, ours was a simple family tree. And then we have numerous factors, yeah? Well, we had 2, age and weight for those relatives of Alice. 3 at a push when we introduced edge degree as a parameter. And then we started thinking about segregating this population using AI. Well, actually what we did was we used k-means clustering on this very small data set. And then we played around with whether we should do the clustering with a fixed seed. So clustering is a sort of mathematical thing, and you can either seed it always with the same seed to start off to find the clusters, or you can just randomly assign the seeding and see what happens. We had a disease spreading through our network through social contact, and then we vaccinated what our algorithm deemed were the vulnerable clusters. And that's all sort of fairly standard thing to do. But then we introduced feedback between clustering and vaccination. And the idea was that ill, in our case, or you might say use illness as a proxy for disadvantage or overlooked in a more complicated social system. You say, well, what about if the data collection doesn't collect the data for somebody, either temporarily or permanently? Okay, so we had this idea that if you were ill for too long, then you were sort of taken out of the clustering for that window of time, and therefore you weren't clustered. And if you're not clustered, you're not vaccinated, right? And so you have this nasty feedback between being ill and not being vaccinated, and therefore carrying on being ill. And then we just wanted to see what happened. And then the thing we played with was whether we seeded the clustering sort of with the same seed always, or whether we updated the seeding as time goes. So it's a fairly innocent change to the algorithm, right? It's the sort of thing that, it's a pressing a button on a computer and you just press yes or no to decide on what the algorithm does, right? And you would hope it doesn't have too much of an impact. Yeah? It's just the clustering. And on the right is just the family tree. And oops, goes again if you touch it. And then this is this idea that we vaccinated the heaviest or oldest, right? So the youngest and least heavy didn't get vaccinated because they were deemed to be okay for this, theoretical disease that we were looking at. So this is the sort of capturing it. So in this Q-COVID, they obviously took some data, applied some algorithm or AI to the data, to determine the strategy. It might have been, does that have the thing in front? I'll put that over there. You might have some bias in the data, or you might have missed some factors, but you can probably fix that. Why is it not going on now? Why is it stuck? Oh, because I'm not clicking it. Okay, because I'm not clicking there. What we were concerned about is now introducing this idea of feedback. So data, algorithm determines vaccination, but then vaccination's feeding back on the data collection, which then feeds back on the algorithm and then the vaccination. And that sort of bias is a bit more difficult to sort of disentangle because it's sort of in the machine rather than something that you're putting into the machine. And then, now this might be difficult to explain, these pictures, because we had to find a way of representing something in a picture that would be better done in a short video. So the first thing was, did it really matter if we seeded the clustering with the same fixed seed as the process ran through time, or whether we updated the seeding every time we reclustered, right? And hopefully it doesn't have that much of an impact because it's a very tiny change to what the algorithm's doing. And then in these pictures, the big ellipses are the clusters, and they change color as time goes by because the clusters are changing in time because of the feedback between vaccination and clustering. And then the shades show how they move in time. And then the nodes, these are the nodes of the population, their weight and age, weight and age degree. And they have a probability of being vaccinated, right? And the bigger the ring, the more more likely they are to be vaccinated as deemed by the algorithm. And if you move it. What's that? Tim's got his mic on. What happened then? So in the first situation, which basically had the features that were being clustered with just the weight and edge degree, and then this either fixing the seed or updating the seed didn't really change what happened. The two pictures looked pretty much the same. These were 1,000. These were the summary statistics for 1,000 runs of our simple model. In the second one, we just changed the features. So this time it's age and edge degree are the features that are being clustered. And then again, everything looks pretty much the same. You know, the ellipses are all moving fairly similarly. Most of the nodes are having the same sort of fate, except for this node 13 here, with this other I've pointed an arrow. So the population scale outcomes are the same, but node 13, on the left-hand side, with the fixed seed approach, never gets vaccinated. It's never clustered. It's never in the clustering algorithm. It's just excluded from the whole process. And whereas on the right-hand side, it's in and does okay. And that the only thing that changed was the sort of underlying, you know, seeding of the algorithm. So a very, very negligible change, right? Had a significant fate for this individual, or you more generally in more complicated situations for a bunch of individuals have had a different fate. And then the final one is where we had age and weight were our features that we were clustering. Again, the only change is the seeding approach. And now the sort of pictures are really radically different, right? If you follow this cluster here that's sort of meant to emanate from this bottom left ellipse here, it sort of goes in search of clusters and sort of just gets a bit lost on one side. And then on the other side, it just goes flying through feature space, right? And then there's other not insignificant changes to the other clusters as a consequence. And so in this case, this small change to the algorithm through the seed has had a massive change for individuals and at population scale. So I just conclude with a sort of hint of a sort of interpretation of this through a sort of historical lens. And so when we came to this sort of paper that we were writing, so Alice was very much, sort of guided by some of the history around disease, looking back at the turn of the 20th century in San Francisco's Chinatown, where there were, all sorts of issues around experimental vaccines and issues of xenophobia and, really horrible things going on for the sort of Chinese populations in Chinatown. You could also draw sort of parallels, these sort of social systems. So we were looking at AI systems, complicated AI systems, but social systems are also very complicated interactions. And, was apartheid an emergent phenomenon, or was it sort of, pre-decided? And then just a couple of quotes, sort of this sort of idea of needing to classify or cluster or segregate things is something that's been around forever. And then my colleague, Kris Allerfeldt, pointed me to this, one of these TED Talk type things. And will.i.am, the sort of pop star, had this, he seems to be interested in AI. And he was basically saying that this next version of computing is predictive. So it was a talk about AI. And it would further put people that come from where I come from in more detriment. That's what will.i.am sort of thinks about AI. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Stuart. That was an amazing talk that more than lived up to my expectations. I pitched you as our person for range. You managed to get will.i.am in there as well. It's very impressive. Very enjoyable talk, and I really like the personal story that you brought to it in terms of chance meetings, that serendipity of meeting Dave Hodgson, who is actually here, so he might want to say something, which then opened the door to all these collaborations and broad ways of applying your skills. So it's a very rich skill set that you've got, but you can apply it to all these different contexts, which is fantastic. I also noticed that Alice, the student you mentioned, is also on the course. It would be very nice to say congratulations to Alice. Fantastic work. And if you want to say anything, Alice, you're also welcome. If you stop sharing screen, Stuart, people can then ask you things and say things by putting their cameras on and showing their faces. And the first one on the queue is Dave. So hi, Dave.
Thanks, Jane, and thank you very much, Stuart. It was great to see the new stuff, and it was great to revisit the old stuff as well. I just wanted to revise history just very briefly, because you talked about me seeking collaboration with a mathematician to try to help improve a grant application, which is the rather dry applied version of collaboration for many people. I don't know if you remember, what happened was you had a cry for help from a junior ecologist who wanted to do something interesting that wasn't being offered by his then department. And what it blossomed into, I think, was that we found some common ground, and you turned my research world upside down, and we talked for more hours than is normally healthy. So that, for me, that paints two very different pictures of collaboration. There is functional collaboration where there's a need and people get together to fulfill those needs. And then there is the more fundamental collaboration, which is the finding of common ground across disciplines, which I guess leads to so you did that for me, and you are one of a small handful of people who have helped me be where I am. I wouldn't be here without you. So thank you for that. But my question is, what do you think is that magic ingredient for turning for the spark that creates more than just a quick conversation about shared needs?
Yeah, so I don't know, in our case it was sort of because we had a fairly easy win. I had this thing that I knew that was sort of obviously and eminently useful sort of straight away. We didn't have to work hard to make it work, because it was just there, it was just ready. Now I don't know whether that was an important factor. If it had been a more complicated mathematical thing, then you probably would have gone away. But because it was just about close enough.
There is something about serendipity, meeting the right person at the right time with the right
And it was
skills, and it all
definitely
coming together.
I did nearly
Right
go
time.
away several times because even what you claim to be simple really was never simple for my brain. But I think what we shared was a passion for the subject, and we made space in our lives to talk about it and to find those kernels that turned into research programs. So I'm a big proponent of finding space to try out these collaborations and find common ground.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Alice, would you like to say anything? It's a very impressive thing to do in your undergraduate project. Here she is. Well done, Alice.
Thank you. I mean, I couldn't have done it without Stuart and Kris, so.
And what are you going to do now with it?
I'm currently on a Art AI PhD program at Bath.
Well done.
Thank you.
And hopefully you'll stay on the long list of collaborations that Stuart's building up into the future. David Baker's got his hand up. Over to David.
Hi, thanks, Stuart.
Hi.
That was really interesting. So, when you're approached by people to work on a project, do you find that you need a well-defined, clear question straight away, or do you sometimes find that someone comes to you with an idea and it takes a while to get to the question and formulate the question in a way that you can then turn it into maths and answer it?
Yeah, often the latter. I think the one with Dave was, special because the problem was already set up the right way, and therefore it was quite easy to quickly, turn it into the maths that I knew. Whereas, with other collaborations, there's quite a lot of a long conversation, to sort of distill, tease out the essential features and mathematicalize them. So that was probably the case with
and
this.
do you find, does that take is what Dave was saying, you had a lot of conversations. Is that something that you think it often take a long time, so you would recommend having early conversations between potential collaborators?
Yes. It's probably not good to have a fully formed thing from your side, because then the other side is left a bit lost. What can they really contribute if you've really decided what it is?
Okay, great, thank you.
I can imagine you're going to have a long list of new potential collaborators after this talk, Stuart.
Oh, no.
More than you can cope with. You're going to have to set up a business to manage it all.
What's this question from Dave then? There's one, and am I meant to be looking at that?
I don't want to queue jump. Can I ask Jane? Can I ask the question?
Yes,
So I was really struck by the comparison between algebra and formulae and Esperanto, and certainly when we teach to life sciences students, one of our struggles is often making algebra available to people. And I don't know, I'm old enough now to have noticed that the mathematical literacy among science students is lower than it used to be. I think it's been lost from A levels. So if algebra is to be Esperanto, how do we stop it from failing like Esperanto did?
Yes.
Good point.
Yes, good point, Dave.
No, I need the answer though.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I was talking to Mark Calloway, one of my maths colleagues, and a lot of this mathematical notation goes back to these French school called the Bourbaki School. So they sort of made it sound like they were naming it after some mathematician, but it was just a clutch of French mathematicians who basically define a lot of the now common formalism of mathematics. The formulas we use. Why we use those letters in that place. But yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, Dave. Yeah, but there Mark has asked me, would you be able to do maths without algebra? Well, that was the other thing when I was trying to prepare this talk, right? I thought I must be able to find a letter written in Latin by Newton to Huck about Newton with Newton's second law in the middle of the page, right? And I thought that would be the great example where you only need the formula, but you can't. In the old days, they used to work. They didn't use algebra. They used words. They used to just talk. And it's only more of a late 19th century thing that everything became more formulas and equations. So they used to talk.
You've had a question from Tim Hughes as well on the chat. I don't know if you can see that, Stuart, or if Tim, you want to ask it yourself.
Yeah, so Tim Hughes asked, can you give a butterfly effect type interpretation to the phenomenon you see by changing the seed? Apologies for switching his mic on halfway through my talk. Yeah, so there might be a chaos type because basically when in our problem that we've only simulated our problem. I mean, I'm talking about the thing with Alice. And we just did simulations, right? We didn't try to analyze mathematically the rather complicated system that we create by cluster, make some decision to leave things out of a clustering, which then impacts on the vaccination. So you're getting this sort of very non-linear stochastic system, yeah? And then whether it is then you make a tiny little change somewhere and it makes, massive changes, so there might be some mathematical analysis of the problem, but that would get pretty heavy. Back to Marcus's point. So there's this book I read a long time ago by Schaefer. So he's an economist, and it's a slim book, and it's about effectively the Parfett theorem, which is a mathematical theorem, and he effectively proves the Parfett theorem in this book. Yeah, it's about 50 pages long, right? And there's no equations in the book. Okay, but it takes him 50 pages rather than one page that you can do it in if you use formulas. But he just argues the proof of the Parfett theorem, verbalized, using economics. So that's doing maths without algebra.
Stuart, we have this weird result at the minute with that some statistics have been done on papers. You've probably heard this, and we know that you can make a statement about the number of citations that you will lose for every additional formula that you include in your paper in the discipline of ecology and evolution. The take-home message from that is that you alienate your audience apparently through the use of algebra. How to turn that into a question?
Yeah, so that means
links to my previous question. How do we get around that? Because the alternative clearly is lots of words or some level of trust.
So then, the papers just become twice as long as they needed to be because you can't put the formulas in.
Or there are tricks we play, like relegating the formula to supplementary material
that nobody ever looks at,
to allow the mathematicians to go and check. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about your joyous algebra being relegated to supplementary materials?
Well, I mean, if the results that matter.
Marcus.
Yeah, just in that context, I think, I mean, it's something which I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think it is, you can show that it's impossible to prove some things just with words, because they are kind of like the algebraic kind of language which has been developed is now more complex as you could interpret it with the words. And the problem with words is they are not uniquely defined. So some words have dual meanings while symbols or algebra doesn't. So I wonder if that is something we have to promote more as mathematicians.
Yeah, I think you're right, Marcus, the ambiguity of language.
The preciseness of the mathematical language is certainly superseding the one of spoken word. In particular, I mean, for example, English is quite a fuzzy language, I feel, not as a native speaker.
That was a bit heartfelt.
No, I mean, that's what everyone says is because their language is, the English in particular is just a very old language which has a lot of these intricacies which are very fuzzy around the edges.
And I suppose it's a bigger social community that's constantly reinterpreting the language and reusing it, so it's quite dynamic. Whereas in a way, maths is a smaller community and there's a great discipline to how you're using your terms. And that discipline is something that's often needs to be applied in the more humanities ends of academia, which can waffle on for pages and pages. And the discipline is something that's actually very attractive about
But I think also the point Stuart made, I don't know, I mean, you can correct me, Stuart, but I guess the point of having that sort of transition from being a fairly sort of pure mathematician working with rather sort of formulaic engineers at some point to talk to life scientists and biologists, it kind of takes you out of your comfort zone as a mathematician, and therefore you kind of have to develop a new language. So all this thing effectively, I think if you would take papers which you would write as a mathematician, you write them for a different audience than the ones you write as a mathematician for a biological audience. So as they said, I guess using fewer, I don't know, I mean, do we have to be sold on the number of citations we need to get for a paper? That's the question. Or do we want to force biologists to look at some formulas? That's a question for Dave.
Yes, that is a question. There isn't an absolute answer to that, is it? It depends what you want to do there.
Well, I mean, the university tells you to get citations for your papers because that is what is our currency we trade in.
But interesting actually as well, this book I plugged at the beginning, Range, about interdisciplinary curiosity, makes an argument about citations that often when you publish on interdisciplinary material, they don't get cited so much early on, but often they are the breakthrough papers that people look back on 10, 15 years later in terms of making a new field or making a really significant argument that at the time gets a bit lost because it's buried in interdisciplinary outputs with complicated things that people don't necessarily understand, but they can be the breakthrough things. So we should maybe make an argument that we should do less is more and focus more on this interdisciplinary path-breaking scholarship rather than just reproducing the kind of same old, which might get cited in the short term, but probably not in the long term. But we're actually 1 minute over time now, so I'm afraid we're going to have to stop this discussion, but it's been a really fantastic state-of-the-art talk, Stuart. You've done a brilliant job. Other things are coming up now, so I hope you're going to have time to read those in the chat and respond, but I've got to go and chair another meeting. Okay. Thank you to everybody else who's come. Even if you didn't ask a question, we didn't see you on screen. Very much appreciate you coming. And again, a big thanks to Stuart. So thank you very much and see you all soon. Great. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, you get